And as a kid, I would play and I'd shout at the TV, you know, as I watched Sesame Street. And I'd say that as an adult, I still often find myself shouting at the TV. And my kids are here somewhere, and they can tell you that I routinely sit and watch, you know, conversations that take place on the news about politics and economics, and I'm hollering back at the television. So the thing that I think helps us more than anything else to begin to shift the conversation in a more productive direction is very simple, actually, and it's to recognize that the federal government, I'm going to say first about the United States, but I know David is going to have me broaden that discussion for you in a little bit, but a government like ours here in the United States is the issuer of our currency, the US dollar. It comes from the US government, and it can't come legally from anywhere else. So how is it different from everybody else, which is sort of the Sesame Street game? Well, I can't issue the US dollar. I'm a user of the currency, and private businesses can't issue the US dollar. Look what's happening in the world today, right? If all of these private businesses whose you know, bottom lines have been clobbered through the coronavirus and the shutdowns and so forth, if they could issue the currency, well, they'd be fine. They could keep all their workers on payroll. They could meet their recurring expenses. We wouldn't have an economic crisis unfolding around us, but they can't. Nor can state and local governments, which is why governors and mayors around the country are pleading with the federal government, the currency issuer, to step up and help them. So once you kind of separate in your mind what makes the federal government different from all of the rest of us, then a lot of the other sorts of myths and misunderstandings about public finances start to fall away on their own. David's taking the call.
And so, Stephanie, most of us think that the way things work are we go out and get a job, we make money, the government takes part of it. That's how we finance the government. You show with a very simple phrase, tab, that's backwards. And explain to us how it's backwards, because it certainly is intuitive and makes sense. I remember getting a paycheck as a teenager and seeing the things that were deducted from it that went to the government. And we all talk about our after-tax income versus our gross income. And government, we're told all the time, has to balance its books, just like families can't spend money they don't have. So walk us through the flaw, the foundational flaw in that idea.
Sure. So I'm looking for ways to use little mnemonics just to sort of help people separate what otherwise economists might present as fancy mathematical models. Well, I didn't want to get bogged down in jargon and all of that. I wanted this book to be really accessible. So I came up with a way to express the ideas using a simple mnemonic. And this TABS model that you just mentioned is the first one that I introduced in the book. And TAB, of course, is T-A-B, right? And so the TAB stands for taxing and borrowing. And it's tabs, plural, so the S is spending, and that comes last. So the idea is that we've been taught to believe that governments pay for things using our money, that they have essentially two options. They can come for our money in the form of taxation, or they can borrow our savings. So taxes and bonds are the two primary ways that governments raise revenue so that they can pay the bills. Taxes and borrowing come first. Only after the government has money can it then finance expenditures, can it then spend. Well, I'm resequencing that, okay? So I'm saying the correct way to think about it is that the spending comes first. And it should, in fact, be logical. If we stop and think about it, we think, well, where do we get the money to pay taxes or buy bonds? The only way to pay taxes is with government money. And the only way to buy bonds is with government money. You can only use the US dollar. Only the currency is accepted for both of those things. So it has to be the case that the government must first make its currency available to the rest of us by spending, or I suppose you could lend it into the economy. But the normal way would be to spend it into the economy to hire people and pay them so they can earn the currency, and then collect a portion of what you have paid out in the form of taxes. And if you choose, you can allow people to take some of the currency that you have spent into the economy and effectively trade it up, right? Trade it in for bonds, which are just an interest-bearing way to hold your US dollars.
Right. So the basic difference between a bond and a dollar is a dollar bill in my pocket just sits there. But if I buy a bond, what you call yellow money instead of greenbacks, the government pays me an interest on it so that it retains value over time. It might go up or down depending on particular conditions, but the fundamental idea is that the interest I'll be paid makes a dollar worth the same today as 10 years from now, which would not be true of a dollar I put in my pocket and 10 years later pulled out to spend, right?
Right. And the thing that we're so kind of taught to believe is that when the government engages in when it runs a budget deficit, when the government spends more than it taxes back, when there's deficit spending happening, that it makes the rest of us poorer. Okay, that's what they've taught us to believe, that it's bad for the rest of us. And in the book, I show that, in fact, that is not true, that government deficits augment our savings. So how that happens would be if the government spends $100 into the economy, but only taxes $90 back out, it has left behind 10 of those green dollars that David just mentioned. So we're augmenting non-government surpluses or savings or wealth. The government's deficit makes a financial contribution to some other part of the economy. Now, they could just leave those greenbacks, as David referred to them, in our pockets, but they don't. Okay, in the present time, the government matches up its deficit spending by selling bonds. So it puts 100 in, subtracts 90 by taxing, leaves 10, and then recycles those $10 into interest-bearing dollars that we call US government bonds. They're treasuries. The problem is we also use another word to describe them. We call it the national debt. And that makes everyone crazy.
So let me pursue that for a second. When I was studying economics in the 60s and the 70s, and I don't think it's changed much since then, one of the fundamental things we were taught is that when the government borrows rather than taxes, it is effectively crowding out private investment. So we don't have money to build factories and research labs or other private sector activities that create wealth if the government is borrowing all this money. And then there's a second part to this, which is the interest we have to pay to those people who hold yellow money, treasuries, rather than greenbacks, itself can become large enough that we could end up with no money to do anything but pay the bondholders. So if you tailor those first and then second.
Yep, these are, David, the thing about the myths that you just described is that they're not just propagated in casual circles. This is the kind of stuff that form the underlying assumptions that, make up the reports that are published by the Congressional Budget Office, that are relied upon by lawmakers when they're making decisions about whether they can vote for a spending bill or something. If the Congressional Budget Office puts out a report and says, oh no, this spending will lead to all of these negative consequences, the crowding out and so forth that you just talked about. So then they give it a bad score and it makes it more difficult to pass good legislation. So in the book, I say, this is backwards. Okay, we're getting this wrong. And the reason that we get it wrong is because, again, we're stuck in this tabs model instead of moving the sequencing around and recognizing the spending comes first, the taxing and borrowing are secondary operations. So if that's the case, then this crowding out stuff doesn't make sense. If the government's own spending is augmenting savings in the non-government part of the economy, then it cannot be the case that government deficits use up savings, right, and lead to crowding out of more efficient forms of government investment and so forth. And so once you realize that the government's own deficit spending provides the dollars that are then available to buy the bonds, you realize the government isn't competing for a finite pool of savings and elbowing out the private sector as it needs to take more and more of the savings to finance its deficit. But in fact, it's building up the savings first with its own deficit spending, and then allowing people to recycle some of those dollars into treasuries. So the whole sort of thing falls apart. And then, as you said, interest on the debt is a huge, huge deal. And I did serve for a period of time in the US Senate as the chief economist to the Democrats. And I can tell you that both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, are absolutely obsessed with this line item in the budget called interest on the debt. And they see it exactly the way you just described it, David. They see it as an expense that eats up part of the funds that are available to spend in total. So in other words, imagine your household budget and you say, okay, I bring in $1,000 a month, right? And that's my budget. And my rent takes a third of that, and my car payment takes 10%, and you add it up, and all of a sudden the cable bill goes up. And you say, oh my God, the cable bill has gone up, and so now I can't afford to pay as much for my groceries, or I can't afford, right? It's eating up part of your finite resources. The government looks at its own budget like a household budget. So when it sees the interest expense, that line item increasing, it says, oh, I'm going to have less money available for defense spending, for education, for infrastructure, and a whole range of other things. It's just not the case. The federal government's budget doesn't work like a household budget. Even as interest becomes a bigger and bigger number in absolute terms, there's nothing to prevent Congress from choosing to spend more on defense or education or healthcare or any other line item in the budget. It's not a zero-sum game, and that's what I think a lot of people are missing.
So, of course, that was one of the great insights of Adam Smith, that we can create wealth. And frankly, we've become very good as human beings all over the world at creating wealth. It is not, as Donald Trump talks about, a zero-sum game. A dollar China gets is a dollar we don't have, is not how this works. But, and this is an important but, the government, so long as it has a monopoly on the currency and it controls the currency, can't go broke. We would go broke if we had a revolution, for somebody who's thinking about Russian rubles. But as long as the US government endures, we cannot go broke. But can modern monetary theory lead to us going broke rather than the government through ruinous inflation, deflation, through any mechanism at all? Because I think that's one of the fears people have that's shown up in some of the, I would describe them as petty and closed-minded reviews of your work.
Okay, great question. So MMT can't make policy happen. MMT is a framework of analysis, right? It's an approach to macroeconomics. And sometimes we say MMT is a lens. So if I supply someone with a better set of lenses, you know, your vision was off, you weren't seeing things clearly, and I say, oh, you're stuck in a gold standard world. You don't see how to take full advantage of the monetary system we have today, which is not a gold standard, a modern monetary system. Let me update your prescription. Let me give you a better set of lenses so that you can see the policy space around you. That's what MMT is trying to do. Now, someone could take an MMT understanding of things and try to push it too far, but that would be a violation of the principles of MMT, because what MMT tells us is that we've been paying attention to the wrong limits. We thought that these obstructions were here. We thought we had to borrow from China. We thought we had to raise taxes to pay for everything. We thought we had to borrow from financial markets where they set the terms and decide when and how much we can borrow. We don't know. All of that stuff we clear away, okay? Now we have a new understanding. There's nothing to prevent any government from authorizing budgets and pushing things too far. MMT can't stop that. But what MMT does is to say, hang on, the limits are real. There are limits to how much the economy can handle in terms of total spending, not just government spending, but spending from all sources, including the rest of the world. So you can imagine that every economy has a sort of speed limit, that we have the resources we have the people who are of working age and in the labor force, we have all the factories and technology and machines and raw materials, and we want to pay attention to environmental limits. So there are limits, But once we identify the limits, the goal is to make full use of the resources we have, respecting environmental limits as well, but not to push things beyond those limits, because the punishment for going too far is absolutely inflation.
So one of the important points for those of you who are watching in this is MMT recognizes that the production of goods and services is central to how we address our economy. This is not some fantasy notion of just turning on a government printing press and becoming the Weimar Republic or Venezuela right now. It is about serious level of economics. So I want to go to one other issue, and then we'll deal with the questions that people are posing to us. For 8 years, I taught third-year law students and graduate business students at Syracuse the law of the ancient world, the business law, lots of business regulation, and the property and tax law. And it was really a way to just teach modern law. Why is the law the way it is? And my better students would ask about, well, before we had money as we think of money, greenbacks, in our era, digital deposits in our bank account, wasn't everything done by barter? And your book has important insights about why this myth that has been knocked down by economic historians, but is still widely held, that economies had barter. And there's a word that readers or viewers, I think, need to hear and understand: chartalism. What is that? Why does it matter? And how does it relate to MMT?
Okay, well, for people who want to hear more, there is not a great deal of this in my book, but I do deal with it. But you can also pick up books by Randall Wray. You can read his Understanding Modern Money or his Modern Monetary Theory book. You can even pick up David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. You can read Michael Hudson's work on imperialism. There are lots of resources out there. But you're right to say this barter exchange story is so entrenched within the economic discipline that if you pick up a principles textbook, the stuff we use to introduce first-year students to economics, you will almost inevitably, if you find a discussion of money, turn to the page where the word money first appears, and they tell you a story about where money is supposed to come from. How did we invent money? Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, man conducted his affairs on the basis of barter, trucking his wares to the local trading venue and trying to find somebody who had what he wanted and wanted what he had. It was known as the double coincidence of wants. The only way David and I can successfully engage in exchange, if I'm the shoe salesman and he's the local fisherman, is I'm hungry and I want fish, but I go to David looking for fish, and David says, my shoes are fine. I don't need a new pair of shoes. And he tells me to take a hike. So now we can't engage in trade. So we decide to invent money. This is the story, okay? This is a textbook story. Right. We decide to invent money because it would be so much more efficient if I could hand David something we mutually agree to take in exchange: seashells, beads, whatever, these primitive things that were supposed to have once served as a medium of exchange. And all of a sudden, everything gets more efficient because we've invented this money thing. And over time, the story evolves, and they say, well, beads and shells and other things are heavy and inefficient. We can do better. So people discover precious metals. And those are really cool because they have these nice properties, like they're divisible, melt them down and make different weights. They're durable, they last a long time, they're portable, you put them in your pocket and go shopping. And then eventually you get to gold-backed paper, and then finally where we are today with paper currencies with no metal backing. That's supposed to be the evolution of money and the story that's told and taught to students all over the world. And if you ask an economist to tell you a story about money, that's probably the story you'll hear. If you ask a historian, a sociologist, an anthropologist, a numismatist, a legal scholar, Christine Desson at Harvard University, a wonderful book on this kind of thing, that is not the story that you will hear. Okay? You will get a much richer and well-grounded story about the nature and origins of money, which brings me to chartalism. That's the word that you brought up. So where does money originate? How is this stuff invented? And it's obviously, it takes a lot of work from people who specialize in this. And I'm not a numismatist or an anthropologist, but I read their work. And the quick and dirty way to put this forward is that over a period of time, those with power, could be a palace king, could be a nation state, over a period of time, nations discover that they can invent money, they can define a unit of account, like ours is the US dollar. That's not a thing, it's a name, right? It's a unit of account. And then you can come up with a physical manifestation for that name, a piece of currency, a coin, right? And you can give that otherwise intrinsically useless item value by demanding that thing in payment to yourself in the form of taxes, fees, fines, and other payments. So that's in the book, but it's not well developed like it is in David Graeber or somebody like that.
Well, thank you. What that does, folks, is bring us back to the beginning of this, which is tabs and stabs. Spending followed by taxes and borrowing, not taxes and borrowing enable spending. So let me address some of the questions we have, and I'm going to take them in order. Joel asks, in modern monetary theory, is it applicable at all times, or is it only useful in a large resource-rich economy like the US? What if we were more like Bangladesh, in my words, than like the United States with a mature economy? What if we were trying to do this in Zimbabwe or Cuba, or perhaps a good example might be one of the Caribbean islands that uses the American dollar rather than its own local currency?
So David's wearing glasses, and those glasses are going to be useful to him whether he's traipsing around, rural communities in the United States or the big cities in the US, or whether he goes across the sea to Europe or to Japan or to anywhere else. So as a framework, MMT, quote unquote, works just about anywhere. Where what MMT recognizes is that there is added policy space. So if I say you're a country and, how's my camera angle? You have this much policy space because you've designed your monetary system, or you've made policy decisions that have closed in space around you, constrained your ability to run your domestic policy in the full interest of the domestic economy. In other words, it's robbed you of policy space. How do countries lose policy space? Well, one way is to adopt someone else's currency. So you say a small Caribbean country or something like that, look at Panama or Ecuador. They have dollarized. They just outright adopted the US currency as their own. Well, that closes in policy space because the only way that the governments can fund expenditures is with US dollars, and they don't issue them. So they've got to earn them or borrow them in order to be able to fund their spending. So that limits space. You could do what 19 countries in Europe have done. You can give up your sovereign currency and adopt a common currency, and tell your central bank that it no longer operates in the interest of the domestic economy. So Greece, for example, gave up the drachma, adopted the euro, and the Greek central bank now does not have authority to clear payments on behalf of the Greek government the way the Federal Reserve does on behalf of the US Treasury. You could start borrowing in foreign currency, like Venezuela, Argentina. Russia in the late 90s defaulted on a lot of US dollar denominated debt. You could fix your exchange rate, again, the way Russia did, the way Mexico did with the peso crisis. So the monetary system that you impose on yourself carries consequences, and it can close in policy space around you. So
just very briefly, Stephanie, is it fair to say that so long as a government has monopoly control of its currency, the lens of MMT will tell us what we need to know, but if you choose to be reliant on someone else's monopoly currency, yes, then it would be a contingent situation. It would be less applicable.
Yeah, the MMT lens will help you see how that policy space has become constrained. So I would say that the MMT lens is useful in either case. We can help explain why policy options are more limited for countries that fix their exchange rates than for those that float, more limited for countries that borrow in foreign currencies than for those that don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in the collapse of the U.S. economy in 2007-8, and this comes from Michael's question, we flooded our economy with money. $1.4 trillion deficit that year. We explicitly gave banks and other people hundreds of billions of dollars, over $700 billion. We just saw Congress pass a number of bills that have injected trillions of dollars into the economy, and they're going to be injecting more. The White House has acknowledged they're about to do that. So how is it that we're not seeing Weimar Republic inflation? Why is it I don't need a dollar bill with a face value of 9 zeros after it to buy a loaf of bread at Wegmans?
Well, a number of reasons, one of which is in spite of the fact that these numbers seem very big, we've got, as you say, multi-trillion dollar deficits at this point. Those deficits are backstopping an economy that was in free fall, right? So it is, again, it's about total spending in the economy. You've got to have total spending in the economy outstripping the ability of the economy to keep up with demand. Well, we took a lot of people and asked them to stay home, right? Shelter in place, help flatten the curve. We told various establishments, you cannot open. People didn't go out. It wasn't an environment in which people were spending a lot of money. Savings increased a lot. People stayed home. They spent less money. The government came in and replaced some lost spending, but it didn't come anywhere close to pushing beyond the limits, right, of where you would begin to get inflationary pressure. In fact, there's a lot of room in the economy today for the government, not just to sustain the current level of fiscal support, but to do the kinds of things that the House is asking for, right? The House has passed a $3 trillion bill, and it's the Senate that currently stands in the way, that's saying, oh no, we aren't ready yet. We're not prepared yet to do more, citing in some cases concern about adding to the deficit. And so what I'm saying is not only are we all right holding on where we are, but we could safely increase fiscal support, that is, increase the deficit now, and end up, I believe, with a shorter downturn and a more robust recovery.
Now, one of the things that I teach my current students who are undergrads is ask your parents if when they went to take a loan at a bank to buy a car or a house or anything else, did you ever see a banker pull a drawer open and look to see if there was money there? Did they ever pick up the phone and call the home office and say, do we have enough money today to make this loan? And of course, that's not how it works. But Henrik makes the point that banks create money. And so if banks are creating money by making these digital entries, offset an asset with a liability in each case, is it the government that's really creating the money? And how does that relate to the idea that the government's creating the money when the banks are doing it?
Okay, so that's a good question, Henry. So banks...
Henrik.
Okay, Henrik. That's a great question. And, you know, my book is focused on really public money, and getting the government finance piece right is absolutely the case. And we've all written about private money creation, bank credit, and the creation of money via banks for decades in other places. So let's talk about that. So what happens? David's right. You walk into a bank and you ask for a loan. The loan officer does not pull open a drawer, find out if they have any money. They don't go to the vault to check the vault cash levels. They don't look into somebody else's deposit and say, let me see if Mr. Smith is using the deposit in his account. And if not, I'll just move it over into your account, and that's how you'll get your loan. No. Banks have a very special power. Banks have the ability to create a special kind of money. Okay, it's bank money, bank deposits, and it's part of the US money supply. If I walk into a bank tomorrow and I chat with the loan officer and I ask for a loan, and the loan officer thinks, Kelton's a pretty good credit risk. I think we can make some money. If we give this loan to her, she's going to service the loan on time, interest and principal. Well, it'll be a profitable loan. The loan officer credits my account with, let's say, the $30,000 that I was asking to borrow. Okay, that $30,000 was created essentially out of thin air. The bank uses a computer keyboard, changes the numbers up in my balance sheet, adds 30,000, and now I have a newly created deposit, which is part of the money supply.
And puts on its side of the ledger a $30,000
asset, the loan. The loan becomes the bank's asset. The deposit is the bank's liability. It's my asset, right? The bank is creating a kind of money. What I was talking about earlier is different. I was using the phrase, the federal government is the issuer of the currency. I use the phrase, the dollar, right? So there is a difference between what we call the monetary base or high-powered money and the kind of credit money that banks can create.
So you had an op-ed yesterday in my former newspaper, the New York Times, and there were a lot of comments from naysayers, Michael points out in his note to us. And the naysayers don't seem to realize how many trillions of dollars the Fed has given to Wall Street banks. I just wrote a column at DC Report about the fact that bank deposits by the narrowest measure, called M1, are at record high levels. They're just like those charts of the unemployment rate. They're way up here. So there's lots of cash sitting around. I would call it idle cash, not being spent. And so since the Fed produced something on the order, Michael puts it, $7 trillion from last August until January, how do we arrange the deck, Michael writes, so the Fed is giving money directly to people or individuals who are in need, as opposed to having a system where what we're doing is propping up or deepening the pockets of artificial persons, corporations?
A great question. So, Michael, terrific question. And a lot of people have thought quite a bit about this, and I bet you have as well. You probably already know the answer to your own question. As Chairman Powell continues to remind us, every time he has a press conference, essentially, he reminds people that the Fed can lend, but the Fed can't spend. And so the Fed's powers are limited. Well, where do those limits come from? Well, they come from Congress. Congress could give the Fed new expanded authorities, and in some ways they just did. But they didn't do the kind of thing I think Michael's thinking about, which is to get cash directly in the hands of people who need it in this moment. So there are proposals out there that would have the Federal Reserve essentially create an account for all of us. Banks have accounts at the Fed, so why can't the rest of us have an account at the Fed? A lot of people say we should all have an account at the Fed, and we should all get to earn on that account whatever interest rate the Fed decides to pay the banks. Our deposits should get the same sort of treatment. You could imagine that. What you could also imagine is that if we all had accounts at the central bank, that it would give the Fed a very direct and powerful way to add dollars to bank accounts to people who would actually turn around and spend them back into the economy very quickly, supporting jobs and aggregate demand. So I think that's what Michael is getting at.
And Stephanie, I think your point also goes to one of the fundamental insights that Adam Smith had, that currency operates in a circulatory system. If your venal flow and your arterial flow don't match up, blood will begin to pool somewhere in your body, probably where you sit. And if you don't cure it, it will sour and kill you. So we need to recognize that the circulation of money and the balancing of spending and savings and investment matter in very important ways. Now,
funny that you use that description. I mean, economists talk about leakages and injections, and I don't want to push this too far, but if you've got a lot of leakages, or what you would call maybe a backup in the system, then the economy is not going to perform well. You want to keep the flows at a high level. Yeah.
Right. You want lots of, particularly domestic capital investment, if you want growth in jobs at home, which Stephanie's book spends a lot of time talking about the misunderstanding of all of this as it relates to jobs and how we could have a full employment economy without inflation. Now, Wendy asks, I think, a really good question. Do you know any elected officials currently in office who understand MMT?
That's bait. Wendy, I know what you're trying to get me to do. Yeah, I do. I do. And there are more than some people might think. Look, I'm very fortunate in that I have an opportunity to not only jump on the phone frequently with a variety of different offices, and not all of them Democrats, by the way. The majority are, but not all of them are. But I also get to, when we were traveling, I would get to go to the Hill and have those conversations there as well. And what I can tell you without naming names is that there are members of Congress in both the House and Senate that have reached the conclusion that they have played Charlie Brown to Lucy in the football for a lot of years, and they don't like it. And they believe, I think now, that some of the rhetoric, some of the beliefs that they had about, the dangers of fiscal deficits and the risk of adding to the debt or whatever, they recognize that they've had some things wrong. And now they're looking to have conversations about how to begin to unwind. How do we start to move in a more productive direction with policymaking and with our narratives, because once you've gone around for so many years saying, we were the party, if you're a Democrat, we were the party that balanced the federal budget. We put the budget in surplus. That was the Bill Clinton years. That was what Democrats largely were responsible for. So it was the Republicans who came in and messed everything up with their unpaid wars and their tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts and so forth. So they really built that surplus as a badge of honor for a long period of time. And now they got to kind of come to terms with the fact that they had some things wrong. And I just want to say the good news is that I've been encouraged by a lot of conversations that I've had.
And the general trend of economics in the post-war years, 75 years seems to me plenty of time for us to draw some conclusions, has been that when we have run deficits, the economy has tended to do better. We had more jobs created during periods of more government spending than less. I did a chart once showing jobs created under each president since 1940. And it was remarkable how it lined up with Democrats in the White House, but because of the spending policies, which were to put more money into the economy, which resulted in more investment and jobs in various ways. A person who calls himself Busted asks, I'm having a hard time getting, quote, grow our way out of debt, end quote, out of my mind. And what exactly is the difference between they have percent sign GDP and MMT? Is there sort of a max out here on the gross domestic product? If there's a contraction? And I think the question they're trying to get at is if we borrow excessive amounts of money, aren't we going to damage GDP?
Okay. So once again, we want to resequence so that we get out of the tabs and into the stab model where we get that the spending comes first. Because if the spending comes first, then you realize that the borrowing operation, so-called, or the bond sales are purely voluntary. Warren Mosler, you mentioned the New York Times op-ed that I did. Warren likes to call interest on government bonds UBI. And he calls it universal bondholder income. He says it's basically money for rich people. If you're wealthy enough to be able,
like Warren,
to be able to save some money and invest those dollars, to hold them in the form of interest-bearing dollars, well, that's a pretty good deal for you. Okay, and so Warren's position actually is that we should phase that out. That we should not be. That it is not a good use of public money to be providing a basic income to bondholders annually, monthly, right? That there are better ways to use resources. So when I think that so much of the growth obsession is bound up in our debt obsession, because as he said, as Buster said, or Busted said, this idea that we have to grow our way out of debt, that belief is rooted in the idea that the national debt is itself a problem, and that the way out of the problem is to grow your way out of it, right? So you think of the debt to GDP ratio, and you say, oh, I can get out of this mess if I can make the denominator grow very, very fast, because if it's a fraction and the denominator goes up a lot, the fraction gets smaller. So the debt to GDP ratio falls. So if you're obsessed with debt and you think debt is a terrible, tragic, high risk sort of, threat to national security, as we've been taught to think, then the way out of the problem is to grow the GDP. So we make this an obsession. Growth becomes an obsession. But I'm saying the thing we call the national debt is nothing more than the money the government spent into the economy and did not tax back that is currently being saved, held in the form of US treasuries. That's all it is. So we could think of it, busted, as just part of the US money supply. There's nothing to grow out of, right? It's all just part of the net supply of US dollars.
And in accounting, of course, all assets are offset by liabilities or shareholder equity if it's a company. And it's not like this is a one-sided mountain here to deal with. Those of you, when you read Stephanie's book, she tells delightfully a story that Warren Mosler, who was the one who introduced Stephanie and into this idea about trying to get his children to do chores. And she doesn't say so, but part of their attitude was, Dad, you're a super rich guy. What the heck? Why do we need to do it? Hire people to do this work. And of course, he has a parental observation here. And the story is absolutely delightful and instructive about everything about MMT as to how he got his children to do the chores by, in essence, taxing them in return for the benefit they got of living in his house, being fed, having a bed, et cetera, to sleep in. It is on a core level to people who are not economists, a delightful and enduring way in your memory to think about the principles that the deficit myth is about. Now, one of the questions from Luis, given the banks all have an account with the Fed, wouldn't the source of all created money still be the Fed rather than the US government, the Treasury?
Well, when we start talking about what to include in a definition of money, things get very murky. You probably, you may or may not know this or remember that many years ago, Alan Greenspan, when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve, was in for his regular testimony before, I don't know if it was a House committee or a Senate committee at the time, but he's a House committee. So David, you know this story. And he's being grilled, right? He's got all these House members around, and one of them says,
it was Paul Ryan. It's very important. It was Paul Ryan, who was the leader of the Republicans, and he's the one who asked the question, and he thought he was going to get an answer that would support.
Oh no! Well, I think we're telling two different stories. The Paul Ryan story is definitely in the book, and one that everyone should hear and watch the video on YouTube. But there was another story with Greenspan where he's asked about money. What is money? And one of the House, I think it probably was a House member, holds up a credit card and says to him, "Is this money?" Well, then you get a long Alan Greenspan type answer, which is exactly what you would get from almost any economist, because we have as broad or narrow a definition of money as we choose for whatever purpose we're using. The Fed has, base money. They have M1, they have M2, they have M3. They used to have all these L1s and L2s. So no, I guess the answer to the question is no, but only because we get to define money to include a broad array of financial instruments.
Okay, Paul Krugman writes that MMT is really sort of a repackaging of existing ideas, and it's not new. He says, for instance, that he agrees with Keynes that deficits are not a problem. He concludes they just don't understand your claim that MMT is something new. So can you address Paul Krugman's critique?
Yes, but how much time do we have left?
We got a couple of minutes. So.
Not enough to go through all the ways in which MMT is unlike conventional mainstream macro. So look, I do this in the book, and essentially every chapter is a sharp departure from what I was taught. And I have a PhD in economics. So I took the intro, I took the intermediate, I took the master's level, I took the PhD. I can tell you that nowhere in my conventional training as an economist did I encounter the kind of ideas that are in this book. So they aren't just standard Keynesian or conventional macroeconomics. From the first chapter all the way through to the last one, we talked a little bit about the loanable funds theory already. We talked about crowding out. This is all, fundamental to conventional economic thinking. The STAB versus the TABS model, the purpose of taxes. Nowhere did anybody tell me that the purpose of the tax was to start up a currency, to create a demand for otherwise worthless pieces of paper, to regulate inflation, that the purpose of bonds was about supporting interest rates, not financing government. So I've probably given you 7 or 8 pretty big differences, that monetary policy isn't a powerful tool to steer the macroeconomy, that interest rates probably don't work the way we think they do, that raising interest rates might be inflationary and not the way the conventional wisdom teaches, that interest rates are the way to stop inflation. Why? Because increasing interest rates increases interest income to bondholders. And if you believe that people spend at least some of their interest income, then you got 2 things happening. Raising interest rates is viewed as contractionary monetary policy, a way to slow the economy down by making credit more expensive and so forth. But MMT recognizes that it does something else. It also increases interest income. And so while cutting interest rates can have some expansionary effects, especially in housing and probably auto sales, there's also the potential for accelerating spending because you're increasing interest. It's just another form of payment into the economy.
So let me combine questions from 2 different people in the audience. I think they're very interesting. Why is the national debt not a burden on future generations? And the other one is Japan, as a practical matter, practicing MMT? They have current federal government, national government debt in Tokyo that's, I think, around 190% of the GDP. It's well above GDP. So is Japan effectively practicing MMT? And what about the burden on our, grandchildren, which I have and someday you may have?
Look, the greatest burden that we are going to place on future generations is leaving them with a climate that's not inhabitable, with infrastructure that continues to deteriorate, with schools that are underfunded, growing classroom sizes. This is the world we're potentially leaving to the next generation. The bonds, again, are just part of the US money supply. They're just the dollars the government spent into the economy, didn't take away from us and let us hold on to in interest-bearing form. They're not risky, they're part of our wealth. They're part of our savings, if you're fortunate enough to have some of these things, right? So there are distributional issues, and that's what Warren is raising when he calls it UBI for bondholders. But don't worry about the bill being passed on to the next generation. Look what happened in World War II. My grandparents fought, right? And the national debt increased and the bonds, the number of bonds outstanding increased. And I was the next generation. I was the generations that followed. So I didn't have a harsher life as a consequence of the increase in the debt and so forth. We built the middle class. We built, our educational system and various industries, right? We had a thriving economy. For 2 decades, we had what they called the golden age of capitalism. And then we began to unwind a lot of those investments. So,
and Japan?
And Japan, quickly. Japan's debt to GDP ratio, if you go all in, the thing is closing in on 250%. So it's well above the boundaries that conventional economics taught us were sustainable. And the reason that Japan is sitting there with the largest public debt in the entire developed world without negative consequences is because things don't work the way we've been taught to believe that they work. So where is the inflation rate in Japan? Barely above 0. They've been battling deflationary pressures for decades. Where are interest rates in Japan? If deficits and growing debt are supposed to lead to crowding out and higher interest rates, where are Japanese interest rates? The 10-year is 0 by policy proclamation, by policy action, and the overnight rate is negative. So we got a lot of wrong-headed thinking to correct. And I hope the book helps us to get a good start on that.
So I want to sum up here about what we've discussed. When I first heard about MMT from Randall Ray and Stephanie and other people at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, I struggled with it. And in fact, I said to one of them, look, if I can't understand this, the American public will never understand this. You got to figure out how to explain this to people who are not intellectuals, who are not pointy-headed people who think about these issues every day. And I think Stephanie would reasonably conclude the many emails and notes I've sent her over the years needled her endlessly about this point. Her book, The Deficit Myth, is a really superb job of making this understandable. Now, if you have a high school education, I think you'll struggle with parts of the book. Skip over those parts of it. But if you went to college, you should be able to grasp this book and understand it. And it is full of useful ways to think about it. And you should approach this book the same way that you would the heretical idea of Galileo Galilei that destroyed geocentrism and got us to heliocentrism, the recognition that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, it's the other way around. Recognize the heretical idea put forward by Adam Smith, which has totally transformed the world, that because you have a piece of gold doesn't mean I don't have a piece of gold. And that enduring idea of mercantilism is so pervasive, it is promoted by the President of the United States. We know how to create wealth, and we've really become very good at it, especially as we've moved away from an industrial economy to a digital economy on our way to a genetic economy. And so I hope all of you will read this book and reread it if you need to, and think about it and engage people, because this is a fundamentally life-changing and global-changing idea that can make us wealthier, that can reduce poverty, that can have us be much more productive, that can have us educating our populace better in the world that's becoming increasingly complicated. So Stephanie, before we back out to the Strand, our host of the Strand, is there something you want to wind up with us?
Well, I want to say thank you to you, because you did needle me. And I remember maybe one of the first video chats that I ever had back when these things were maybe just taking off. It was with you, and I reached out to you to get some advice about how to approach a project like this. And your words stayed in my head throughout the many years-long journey to bringing this book to fruition. And I remember you said, you know, you have to tantalize me. And I thought, this is economics. What am I going to do to tantalize the reader? But I never forgot that. And it definitely made an impact, and it changed the way that I approached the book. Marianne Williamson, who was a presidential contender in the last election cycle, or this election cycle, came and we had a visit here at my place 2 or 3 years ago. And she said to me, you know, she's the author of many best-selling books. And she said, you have to be pregnant with a book. And I thought, well, all right, this is the longest gestation period in the history of my life, but you know, it's finally here, and it's wonderful that you could be the first person to join me at a book event, and I'm so grateful to you and to the Strand. So thank you very much.
All right, so our host, the Strand, are you there?
Yep. Just wanted to pop in and say
thank you,
David. Thank you, Stephanie, so much for a fantastic conversation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I have dropped the order link for Deficit Myth again in the chat. So if you haven't ordered a copy already, please do. And with that, thank you, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you so much.